Good morning. Lovely to have you guys on again today. Today we are talking all around the Optimise phase of FinOps. I'm joined by Chris, who heads up a part of our consulting organization around cloud and data and AI, and particularly instrumental in the development of our in-house tools around cost optimization of things. And because we live and breathe cloud and cost optimization, we figured he'd be a really good chat to have it. I mean, not all work closely and have great chemistry, right? That's the thing.
Absolutely.
Not a consideration. But look, as a start point, FinOps, we spoke briefly last week around the inform phase. We don't want to do a technical deep dive into everything because there's that content's everywhere. We want to talk about the bits that are gnarly that you're going to get a bit caught up on and ways you can kind of find the things that will make a difference to your implementation, how you handle it, right? So the optimize phase, this one's really simple, guys. It is what can you do to save money? You know, the other aspects of FinOps are very much around your practice, your behavior, and kind of the culture within the organization and how that supports cost saving. Today is let's get the knife out, let's carve up that fat, let's remove it. How can we save you guys money? So really looking forward to this chat because this is always my favorite part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's stuff where we can make a meaningful impact, which is really good.
I love a good ROI. So let's do the boring stuff quickly and get it over and done with because it's the bit that everyone will always start with, the low hanging fruit.
Yeah.
RIs, saving plans, how best to approach this. Let's not dwell too much on it because belts on ground.
Yeah, absolutely. So RI reserve instances, savings plans, hybrid use benefit. These have been around for a long time in Azure and in other cloud providers as well. So from a reserve instance perspective, you are effectively paying upfront monthly or annually, and therefore Microsoft are giving you a discount effectively on your runtime.
Actually, really quick note: the thing that people miss out on RIs, Microsoft have a $50,000 a year, that's a rolling 12-month period, limit on returning them, and at the moment there is no charge for doing that. So actually, one of the things that I'd encourage people to look at as part of strategies behind RIs isn't so much making long-term commitments in your mind. It's actually it's a shorter-term commitment than you might think. So you can be far more dynamic with RIs than you think. So make use of that.
No, absolutely, and we always encourage, pay monthly option is the best thing rather than pay annually. Paying annually was around first. That's why it's a thing. Pay monthly became kind of second as well.
And there's no commercial difference, is there? So money in your pocket is so much better than money in Microsoft's. Sorry, Microsoft.
If you're watching this, really sorry. So from an RI perspective, yeah, you're paying effectively upfront. You're getting a discount. You do 1, 3, or 5 years, depending on what you feel most comfortable with, and that is kind of alongside savings plans. You do one or the other effectively between reservist savings plans. Savings plans is effectively where you are committing to a certain amount of consumption, and then on that consumption, Microsoft are giving you a discount. Being honest, RIs are the better bet.
You get a bigger discount, don't you, as well?
You get a bigger discount. You get more flexibility in terms of cancelling, changing, whatever that meant.
Yeah, I've never been a big fan of savings plans because they're just the added complexity of managing them effectively is a bit of pain, right? So way to think about it is with an RI, you're buying a certain number of discount hours of consumption. With a savings plan, you're committing to spend a certain amount of consumption on VMs, for example, every hour. So whilst you're meeting that commitment, that's great. You're making a 30-odd% discount on 1 year. If you don't make that consumption, you're still paying that rate. So you're effectively not just paying normal price. You pay above normal price to meet your minimum commitment. So if you've got a really spiky variable workload and you go with a savings plan, you are if you try and you got to really balance it to get the most out of it, and it takes a lot of maths and effort that honestly just it's not worth the rub. RIs, generally speaking. And jumping ahead of it, because one of the points that we want to talk around is how you operationalize this and kind of make this a useful strategy. This ties in really nicely into, if you're going down the RI route, standardization of your VM specs, because with savings plans, you commit to compute. If it's VM, if it's a PaaS resource, you're getting the discount. VMs, you can go far more granular, can't you? You go to the individual families.
Absolutely. So you will get a different discount, effectively because it's percentage based on whatever VM SKU you're selecting, but you're generally doing on a family of VMs, like a D series family, an E series family, whatever that may be. So it's advantageous to pick a common set of families that you're using over and over again, because from an overhead perspective, it's just going to make your life so much simpler than having to pick random VM families, because there's a lot in this day and age.
I understand the reason why they do it, right? You want to have specialized compute capability depending on the workloads you're working on. You'll always have more memory intensive ones, and therefore kind of getting the balance of where it right. But I think it's not quite the same as the sort of decision paralysis by sheer volume of options. But you do end up kind of going and assuming you're getting more gain than you really are by going down these hyper specialized compute routes, where actually a little bit less specialized gives you that ability to standardize across the entire workload portfolio you're running and enjoy all of your services getting discounted, the flexibility you get from it. But
absolutely. And just jumping on the last point with hybrid use benefit, even though this is a low hanging fruit one, I kind of wanted to bring this up because I know you've done a lot of work around making this more efficient for customers, because this is where you are discounting your virtual machines because you've got cores that you can put towards you having the operating system paid for already through software assurance, rather than paying for it through the pay-as-you-go costs of a virtual machine. But the trick for this is to pick your cores and your VM series very carefully. As I know you've worked with our team internally to make sure we've got to put a bit of maths kind of around this for customers.
Yeah, I mean, so it's funny, the hybrid use benefit is one of the things that people always highlight. So if you go after your sort of cost management tool providers, the big ones, right? Your Cloud House, Cloud Checker, etc., etc. It's always included in cost saving recommendations as kind of a hey, you could save 30% with AHub. It all depends on you having those licenses to use. So actually, if you're paying for the licenses, if you put the maths together, which people will very rarely get the opportunity to, it's never quite that saving, right? You may be talking about 8 or 9% because you're still paying for the license in another mechanism. It's only if you've got really sort of the old perpetual licenses, you're just paying software assurance on top year on year. That's when you start making massive savings, right? But most people don't have a massive portfolio of, the perpetual licensing looking about that they can just repurpose. But the big pain, and this ties in really nicely to software asset management and IT asset management in general, tracking those licenses is a pain in the ass. It just is. Because how do you know whether the license you're using on-prem is actually also being used in the cloud? So that compliance piece is really regularly missed off, because it's so easy for a cloud engineer to have been told once when doing a migration that, oh, we have licenses for Windows, so just enable AHub. And then the next time we go to do the same sort of project, migrate new workloads into Azure, they just remember, I've got a license, I can just take AHub, and then you end up in a position where you're using far more cores than you actually owned in the first place. And Microsoft, they're not IBM, they're not Oracle, they're not hot on auditing the hell out of you for your AHub usage. I'm pretty sure in the documentation in Microsoft Learn, it specifically calls out actually that it is a trust-based model. But let's not pretend they have the telemetry. They can see it. If your account manager at Microsoft, were to poke around systems in the back end they have, they could put these together and go, hang on a second, guys, you need to buy more Windows licenses or whatever. But the way they have it working, I think this comes down to a legal case years ago, because AWS used to offer the ability to bring your licenses as well. And they kind of applied the logic for on-prem licensing, license mobility rules. The rules for using your licenses in Azure are the exact same as on-prem. So you still have the core minimum requirements. So if you go rogue, I say rogue, that's not the word, but what I mean. You go wild, right? You hit that button everywhere and you've got everything AHUB'd up, but you're running VMs that are below a certain specification. Let's say you do own those licenses. They're not doing the most work for you on those smaller VMs. They will cost you more, in fact, than if you use licenses elsewhere. So that's been the big part of the work that we've been working with the automation team on, is around identifying and making sure that customers have that way to identify where they can get more value out of their AHAB licenses by just reallocating where they assign them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about the fact that this is a percentage-based game at the end of the day, and the fact that if we have where we have helped our customers in the past is actually you've got these larger VMs over here. It might be more beneficial from a cost perspective to you using the AHUB rather than splitting it all out across a load of smaller VMs is probably not going to get the best bang for your buck.
No, absolutely.
At the end of the day.
I'm very conscious, right? We've already spent 10 minutes talking about the stuff I didn't want to focus on.
I saw your watch as well.
So, as a alternative, right? RIs, saving plans, AHUB, lovely. Scheduling.
Scheduling. So, really important. And this is what trips a lot of people out, is the fact that if I go and purchase some reserve instances, a reserve instance is on 24/7 for my virtual machines, for my compute. However, most workloads that are, let's say, not production to make it simple, they don't need to be on 24/7. It is much more cost efficient to have scheduling put on certain virtual machines, maybe non-production, maybe 8 to 8, Monday to Friday, for example. You will not only save money in terms of just the lack of uptime because you don't need it, but you will probably save more money than buying the RI for that particular virtual machine.
So if you do the maths, I think the extended business hours works out like 200 hours a week.
Yeah.
Which is, sorry, not an hour a week, 200 hours per month. And the alternative is always on, I think Microsoft used the average of 730 for a 30-day month. So 200 hours out of 730 in a month is more than 60% reduction. RIs on a 3-year go up to like 63%, I think thereabouts. So rule of thumb, if you've got non-production workloads that can be turned off out of hours, do that before you even think about RIs. But then, and as piecing this together now, right, scheduling with savings plans on top, that might be a slightly more effective way to handle savings plans.
But potentially, yeah. Most of our customers will stay with the RI because it's simpler, it's one thing to manage, one thing to look after.
Yeah.
But to your point, when we've worked with customers in the past, or when I worked with customers in the past, don't immediately jump into an RI for the workload as you've deployed it. Give it some time, plan it properly, because yes, you can cancel the RI. It's still overhead you've got to do and everything on top of it as well. If you can get away with not a 24/7 runtime, it's probably going to be significantly cheaper for you than actually going whole hog with an RI on top of it anyway. So it's being able to plan that appropriately up front as well. But also to add on top of that is spot VMs as well. So if you have virtual machines where they're dev machines, they're non-production, you don't really mind if you're going to get the workload interrupted. Don't do an RI on that would be my opinion when we've worked with customers. And the fact that you can enable spot and you'll get a steep discount on that runtime. If you don't mind if it gets interrupted, then that is an absolute win, especially for dev workloads as well.
That reminds me, actually, a couple of years ago, there was a tool, a product called Spot that came out that was it was for AWS, sadly, it wasn't available on Azure. That orchestrated that sort of, you have a 24/7 workload, one that you typically RI. Instead, they put an orchestration layer in place that effectively, played the game of RI marketplace and taking them discounted from elsewhere and spot VMs, and kind of as the price of the spot VMs increased and got to the point of where moving to a different spot VM would then be cheaper, it played that game for you and offered enormous discounts and savings. But unfortunately, because it's AWS only, they couldn't work on the Azure side. But that was the first really innovative tool that I saw, certainly in the last probably 8 or 9 years, around cost savings, because it's a pretty well-trodden market in terms of what you can do, and most tools focus on visibility rather than orchestration. So I think, how can we take things like RI, savings plans, spot, scheduling, and then apply automation onto that? How can we take that the next step over?
Yeah, absolutely. So from an automation perspective, we work with a lot of customers where, or I've worked with customers in the past where we will do the scheduling, where they can programmatically make changes to that scheduling quite easily in a centralized way. So they can define that as a process for their business and for their particular workloads. Or if they're using spot VMs, it's programmatically handling that spot VM if it gets evicted and then programmatically just bringing it back up in a different region or different zone, for example, to get around that kind of eviction process as well.
I can see this ties in really nicely into like tagging policies as well, right? If we're talking about strategically, how do you save money? I think a big part of that, partly why is part of this flow of the FinOps lifecycle, right? Inform, then optimize. Being able to get visibility of what you can do with certain workloads. So knowing that that workload is non-production, for example, having that tagged so automation picks it up. Where else can we play with this? How can we take this to the extremes?
Yeah, and I think tagging policy sometimes gets a little bad rep, I think, from a technical perspective, because it's effectively a label, what's in it for the technical person. But from a visibility perspective and going towards this more FinOps model of, okay, you guys are responsible for this workload, and therefore you're going to label it so everyone within that responsibility model knows what this workload is. The fact that you're effectively informing that team and the team around it much more clearly just makes it easier to manage from that perspective as well. It means that, okay, this is a non-production workload. I want my team to be thinking about, if it is non-production and labeled as such, have we done the spot VMs right? Have we done the RIs right, or not done the RIs because the uptime is low? Yes, it's not a technical challenge per se, but it just keeps everyone in that loop, front of mind, basically from that perspective as well.
Yeah, so thinking a bit broadly here, what are the dirty tricks to saving costs in cloud? There's got to be things you wouldn't think about necessarily off the cuff, right? To take the low-hanging fruit, park that for a bit. Everyone can do that. Doesn't take much. You just look over and consider it. It's taken time. Where are the areas that people don't think about? I'm thinking things like data residency. And if you're not using production data or sensitive data in a non-production environment, what is stopping you from using North Europe, which is 5-10% cheaper, right?
Absolutely. And I think this is something that isn't that well advertised and therefore not well understood. Now, as you say, if you take data sovereignty and just kind of don't read too much into this, but park it. I know that's not the simplest thing in the world.
That's park security.
Yeah, park security at the moment. But so let's just say you didn't have that barrier, as it were. Different regions in Azure will cost differently. One region to another. So if you run your workloads in maybe Norway, for example, you will get a different cost for that workload than running it in the UK or the US or France or whatever that may be. So for me, it's thinking about placement of your workloads in a much more larger geographic form is one way that you're going to end up particularly saving costs as well. The other is, more importantly, is thinking about, it's two things actually. Think about transformation is another thing. If you can get away with not just running IaaS by default, and a great example of this is file servers. So if you transform file servers into Azure files, not only do you get a lot of redundancy and a lot of overhead reduced, just because it's so much simpler to manage, but it's more often than not, from our experience, it is cheaper from a running cost than running really large virtual machines. It's
a great example, I think, that sort of scenario of modernization into using, I guess, kind of somewhere between a PaaS, SaaS experience of files, right? Of where you should use the cloud over traditional on-prem hardware. Like the number of conversations and opportunities we have with customers talk about migrations, and the assumption is that it'll be cheaper in the cloud. We do this weekly, right? Have to reset customer expectation, remind them, well, actually, the cloud is found more expensive typically than hardware, but that's only if you're looking at 8 gig of RAM or a CPU core versus one on-prem. It's more expensive in the cloud always. It catches people off. What you are paying for in the cloud VM isn't just that VM, that one core, 1 gig RAM, whatever. It's the redundancy, it's the flexibility, it's the control plane, it's the automation capability that makes it a far more resilient solution, broadly speaking, and more efficient, like you say. You might hit me a little bit for this because we've had fairly passionate conversations about greenwashing. This feels a good moment to say as well, actually, unplanned apologies. With the data residency conversation, right, and moving to different regions, you got to remember that, thinking about Microsoft, AWS, GCP, they're all committed to, carbon neutrality within the 2030 sort of region. That is largely based on commitments, and they put green energy into the grid that they rely on for their data centers. So with data residency, for those organizations that are focusing a lot on your carbon strategy and reporting and the ecological impact of our data operations, remember each region is powered by a separate grid typically, right? You mentioned Norway, they're generally far greener and more economical in terms of energy production. So if you are that way inclined as an organization, and it's a really hard argument to have around the Azure side in particular, or hyperscale cloud anyway, because just because you aren't using a VM of a set spec doesn't mean that hardware isn't still running and drawing power. So there's an obfuscation issue around observability, right? But
absolutely,
if you are ecologically minded, using alternative regions can be not just cheaper, but could also be more environmentally friendly, assuming Microsoft are turning the dial down and turning things off for us, right?
Yeah, it's a balancing act. If you do have that green ops requirement, as it were, and that is coming into your ROI calculation somewhere within your business, it's balancing the cost of the runtime for the region versus what it's going to give you back. And we mentioned Norway, Sweden, they are at the top of the list from a green ops perspective, from Microsoft's perspective in terms of those data centers. France is very much up there as well from a region in terms of what the grid is using.
Germany very much not, surprisingly. Germany.
Yes, yeah. I'm not quite sure why, but there we go.
Here's what it is. Yeah. So other than data residency, what else is there as far as sort of the untapped joys of optimization?
So one thing that often gets missed up front and is a pain to change later on is redundancy for your workloads as well. So when you think about your running workload and your RTOs and your RPOs for that workload in terms of getting the backups back, and the rest of it, that you have a choice at the end of the day in terms of you're balancing risk versus cost. And we take backup ops, for example. I can do LRS based redundancy, which is local. You get 3 copies in the local data center that you select, or you do things like GRS, which is I'm going to have 3 copies over 2 completely separate regions for added risk of a region failure or something like that. However, the GRS is going to cost you a lot more, roughly double than what the LRS one is going to be. And you can't change it when you really start using that workload. It's very, very difficult to then basically having to, you can't really extract the backups out of the vault to go over to another. So it becomes very, very tricky to change later on down the line. If you think, well, actually, I want to save some money on my redundancy, you really need to plan that up front and what your RTOs and your RPOs are going to be to make sure you're balancing the cost versus the business risk that you will have from that perspective.
And actually, now you're talking around backups and things, it reminds me of a couple of scenarios we've seen in the past where customers have wanted to implement snapshot backups rather than having incremental, and that adds up so quickly.
Really quickly. It's not like VMware. It's that when you're snapshotting, you can do incremental, but you are effectively paying for effectively a second managed disk is the way it works behind the scenes. So again, you need to make sure that you're planning things like snapshots, managed disk allocation, and the redundancy ahead of the workload placement before you start really running with it in Azure from that point of view.
And this brings us nicely into kind of the FinOps lifecycle as a general principle, right? That's the reason why it is intended to be such a cultural change in the organization, is because these decisions you make up front around disk sizes, workload location, things like that, if you aren't thinking cost consciously at the design stage, in the way, like if you're not being creative with it, right, it's very easy to take a technical problem and give you a technical solution and not think about the whole picture. That whole FinOps lifecycle of planning and becoming a cultural change in the organization to put cost as a accountability across everyone being responsible for the costs that are being incurred. That's how you catch those pieces where otherwise it's too hard to then wind it back. And changing your backups from GRS to LRS means you end up having to effectively write off 30 days of backups and be at risk for a window, or running double you need to.
Yeah, and this kind of leads into more of the strategy piece as well, in terms of the one thing I stress with customers and my team stress with customers is this is really where infrastructure as code really comes into play, because you are effectively parameterizing your requirements up front, and you're effectively forcing that team to say, right, every time we build a new workload, these are the parameters that need to be understood and kind of signed off, as it were, before you deploy it. What's the redundancy? What's the SKU family? What's the RI that I want to apply to this particular workload? If I want to apply an RI, is this going to be a spot because it's non-production? Have I got the tagging policy all set up? By doing it in a controlled manner through infrastructure as code and then doing it through pipeline deployments in Azure DevOps, it means these things aren't, well, you're minimizing these things being missed, and then having what is a ball ache, to be honest with you, of having to change these behind the scenes post those deployments and when the workload's all been settled in. So my take with this is from a strategy perspective, is being able to plan this appropriately and really start thinking about infrastructure as code to make sure you're parameterizing all of these tricks and make sure everything is understood and everyone is informed in that group of what you're doing for those particular workloads on that.
Yeah, and on that informed side, I think it's really important. You see it all the time, don't you, with customers, where the approach to cost optimization is put a diary appointment to, kick the tires, review it on a regular basis to make sure you don't have any surprises, on a monthly sort of billing basis. More often than not, I see that fail. And generally speaking, it's because there's always something more important. Like, we all know cost saving is really important. It's important not to get caught out by your invoice, but there's always something else that at that moment in time is more important. And you find yourselves not taking action for 3, 6, 9 months. And before you know it, it's always the thing that gets kicked out of your diary at the last minute. So I guess, look, the request is I'm imploring you, be religious with this stuff. When you decide to run it that way, that's fine. You do what has to work for your organization, for your workloads, but don't kick it down the can down the road all the time, because more often than not, when we work with customers and we scope out cost optimization, we highlight to them, here's the savings that are in your estate. Let's do something about this, and they take it away, and something else comes up, and you just see it trickle. And it's some of the easiest stuff to action, but you actually have to take action. So, what can you think of right this second? Put you on the spot. Tips and tricks. Didn't think that would be a point teaser this morning for keeping on top of this stuff and actually doing the work.
Yeah, like I said, the strategy piece is key. So running down the list of, I've got my workloads in Azure right now. Are they tagged properly to start off with? So I've got an understanding of what we're doing, and then from that tagging policy, mixing up production, non-production, dev, for example, and then off the back of it, right, understand I could do RIs for these production ones because they're going to be here for a while. You're thinking like domain controllers, network virtual appliances, those kind of things are going to be long RIs. And really just, like I say, parameterizing these things in terms of those things, but also the decom side of things as well. The amount of customers we speak to where they don't have a strategy around this, and they start deleting workloads so they don't need them, but they leave things like managed disks alive. And because you've deleted the compute, you just haven't deleted the storage. And then we see so many customers where they just don't realize these snapshots are still there, the disk itself is still there, the vault data is still there. So as I say, the strategy and parameterizing all of this end to end is really, really critical.
So effectively, automate as much as you possibly can, so you don't have to think about it.
Absolutely.
Fair enough. We're at time. I don't know if there have been any questions coming through, but we probably need to wrap up, be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you everyone for joining. We have another session on the 10th of June, I think it is, where we're going to be talking around the operate phase. Thank you very much for joining, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you.